Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall, and today I'm joined by...
I'm Andrew Prokop, and I cover politics at Vox.com.
Yeah, thanks for being with me, Andrew. We have a couple different topics that I wanted to talk about here today, and all of them relate to 2014 election polling. The first topic that I wanted to get to is, I'm not sure what to call this, but we'll say the 2014 polling aggregator fight that has arisen between Nate Silver of 538 and Sam Wong of the Princeton Election Consortium. There's been, I'm not entirely sure who started the fight, but Sam Wong's model has shown a much more favorable election landscape to Democrats than basically every other model out there. And Nate Silver has been kind of throwing shade in Wong's direction here, saying, you know, this looks like an outlier, he's not doing this properly, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to kind of, you had a post on this on Vox, do you want to kind of break this down for us?
Sure, and I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, there are a lot of different forecasting models that are out there this year. At Vox, we're currently following 6 of them. And the spat is really just between Nate Silver of 538 and Sam Wong of the Princeton Election Consortium. And so basically, there's sort of 2 main issues that have been brought up in this spat. According to Sam, he likes to emphasize that his model focuses only on the polls. And he argues that Nate Silver's model and additionally the Upshots model and the Washington Post model combine polls with other factors that are called fundamentals. And these fundamentals, whether it's, you know, how much money the candidates have raised, how the state did in the 2012 elections, how Republican or Democratic candidates did then, and they sort of correct for where the forecasters think the polls might go wrong. So Sam likes to mention that his model is only based on polls and not fundamentals. The issue there is that there are other models that are also only based on polls, and right now they're showing results much closer to Nate's than to Sam's, which gets at the other major issue here, which Nate has described as how the various models handle uncertainty. So basically, when the polls are not quite clear or are a bit inconsistent or there's not that much polling, how do the models correct for what they might think are bad quality polls or not enough polls or something like that? And Sam's approach is a little different here because he issues what he calls snapshots, which are sort of what he refers to as high confidence estimates of who is ahead in the polls right now. And Nate and others have basically said it's kind of absurd when the polls are so close, just a couple of points separating some of these candidates, to be so confident that one candidate or the other is ahead. So that's sort of what they've been fighting about. Nate has emphasized that right now fundamentals don't actually make that much of a difference in the 538 model, and he really sees the issue as more this calculation of uncertainty and how the models deal with correcting for this potential uncertainty.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what's another outfit that's sort of a polls only model that differs from Wong? I mean, I'm pretty sure Real Clear Politics is polls only. Am I wrong on that?
Real Clear's Politics, they don't have a specific model, but what they do is they take the most recent poll from each pollster that's polled a race over a certain time period, and they just strictly average them. So, I mean, you can consider that a very simple model. The other Huffington Post pollster has created another one that's also based just on polls, and Daily Kos Elections has done the same. And right now, Daily Kos Elections is showing an edge for Republicans, and HuffPost pollster is pretty close to evenly divided, and whereas Sam's model still gives Democrats the edge.
Right.
But one other thing to point out here is that when it comes to the actual number of seats that they're projecting that each party wins, the models aren't very split at all. It's basically a dispute over whether the Republicans will win 50 seats or 52 seats right now. So it comes down to just different projections in a couple of races that really sort of, in most recent election years, they haven't really mattered for control of the Senate because it hasn't been that close. But this year, it's so close. There's so many races that are so close and could make the difference for which party controls the Senate that these issues are sort of important in trying to forecast what's going on.
Yeah, and to that confidence point that you made, I think Wong's Princeton Consortium is projecting an even 50-50 split as the most likely outcome, but he also, like you said in these snapshots, says he thinks there's a 70% chance that Democrats hold the Senate, whereas Silver's projecting, I don't remember, 51, 52 seats for Republicans, and like you said, that's a one or two seat difference, but also projects a majority, more than 50% chance that Republicans do take the Senate. So it does seem to come down to that confidence factor, and that's what I know a lot of progressive blogs have hung their hat on, this 70% confidence chance that Wong's projecting, whereas I guess, and I don't understand the whole confidence projection here, but it does seem like most of them are projecting 50 seats at least for the Republicans at this point.
Yeah, at this point, Sam's model has sometimes shown them going down to 49, but today it's at 50. And what's, I guess one thing that's going on here is that Sam issues what he calls a meta forecast, and he likes to de-emphasize what individual races are showing at any particular moment and focus on sort of more of what's been happening over time. So he says that his snapshots in individual races shouldn't necessarily be relied on as a prediction for what's going to happen. But when you look at sort of the history of all these snapshots over the whole period that he's tracking, it helps lead to this meta forecast where overall Democrats have led more polls in the close races since, June or so. And he said on Twitter, basically, if the poll medians from July to September turn out to be right, then I'll be right. And what seems to be happening now in a couple races is that Republican candidates are all of a sudden putting up much better margins in certain polls. We're seeing in Colorado, Cory Gardner has just led 3 polls in a row by pretty high single digits, and he wasn't putting up numbers anywhere near like that in the summer. So if the polls change, then Sam's forecast will change, and we'll probably eventually get pretty close to the other ones. But right now, it appears to be a little slower to adapting to certain recent really good polling results for Republicans in a couple key races.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the kind of consensus forecast was swinging Democratic, and everyone was saying, oh, well, was Sam Wong right all along? And then last week there was a swath of polls that looked like it was swinging back for Republicans. I wanted to talk a little bit.
And no one knows, I mean, if you go to the Upshots forecast, they have a pretty cool feature where they show the forecast for every day since January and how it's moved, their confidence chance, their percentage estimate chance for the Republicans taking over the Senate. And you see that it goes up to 60% for a while, up to maybe 66%, and then down close to 50 again, and then up again.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a question of whether we're seeing real movement here or whether this is all kind of just noise, and
Right.
if it's always just kind of misleading to look at what's happened in the past week, and if it's always better to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of along those lines, these fundamentals that some of the models try to account for. Like you said at the upshot, they have like some weights that they put onto the polls, but you can also there create your own kind of polls only forecast that you can look at. That's really neat as well. But I know one of the things that goes into a couple of these is the generic congressional ballot. And that is looking more positive for Republicans than I think it has ever looked in the Obama era, which has some people in the kind of conservative election poll watching blogosphere pretty excited. But then there's other conservatives who try to tamp that down and say that, like you said, looking at some of these individual races is much more important than the generic congressional ballot, because it doesn't quite matter in the Mark Udall, Cory Gardner race what the generic congressional ballot looks like. It matters what the polls in that race look like. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how this kind of fundamentals model applies when you're looking at an individual race like that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when it comes to the specific forecasting models, they're all making the polls more and more important as this goes on. And so the Upshot, the Post, and 538 are all relying mainly on polls, like almost getting to be almost entirely on polls as October goes along. So we probably won't see that much of a divide going forward. But when it comes to the congressional ballot, I guess the hope for the people who are hoping for a Republican takeover and seeing those promising numbers in the generic ballot is that it's kind of a leading indicator that after the generic ballot moves, then the individual races, which are sometimes take longer to poll, are in these further flung states. So maybe the theory is that the congressional ballot movement is picking up some movement overall in the country that hasn't trickled into the individual races yet. But I think one thing to keep in mind there is that there are Senate forecasts that are based almost entirely on the generic ballot. One of them is by a professor at Emory, Alan Abramowitz. And he basically, if the Republicans have a tie on the generic ballot, he predicts that they would pick up 5.7 seats in the Senate, considering how many Senate seats of each party is at risk this year. And if the Republicans have a 5-point advantage on the generic ballot, he predicts they'll pick up 6.8 seats. So the movement from a tied generic ballot to an R+5 generic ballot in his model, which is based on, the history of all recent Senate elections, is only worth one more seat. So if you're seeing movement of a couple of points of the generic ballot from, say, a tie to Republicans advantaged by 5, I wouldn't say that necessarily that history has shown that it will make that much of a difference in the overall seats. According to Alan Abramowitz's analysis, at least, it's only worth 1 or maybe 2 if we get an even bigger swing. So it'll still come down to the individual races, the individual candidates, and the campaigns that are going on there, I think.
Yeah, I think it makes sense that we saw this in 2012 as well, that the polling aggregators kind of converged closer and closer the closer we got to the election, because like you said, a lot of the fundamental stuff is meant to be predictive. It's not meant to say, if people go into the ballot box today, what will the vote look like? We're still predicting what the vote will look like on election day in November, not if they go in there today, because that might be a bit different, and that might be the kind of biggest split between polls only models and predictive weighted forecasts like 538s and the upshots. That they're not trying to just merely say this is what the race looks like today. It's supposed to be this is what the race is going to look like on election day.
Yeah, and these guys have all, or at 538, I know they've extensively modeled, how did the polls of the races look in September, and how did those races turn out in November?
Right.
That is, how much were the September polls on target versus off? And some of the polls only models don't do that as much. So some of the more sophisticated models take that historical data into more account. And I mean, if everyone thinks back to 2012, there was a brief period of time after the first presidential debate where Romney took the lead in a bunch of polls in a bunch of key states. And one of Nate's victories in 2012 is that his model, it moved a little bit in Romney's direction, but he had those fundamentals taken into account, and his model was not swung by that brief noise after the first debate, and it still kept predicting an Obama victory all along, and that's what ended up happening.
Yeah.
In Senate races, that's a little harder to do because the race for the presidency, political scientists have a pretty sophisticated understanding of a bunch of the factors that end up really making a difference on a national level. And when it comes to individual Senate races, they're much harder to predict. So there have been races in recent years where the polls were just totally wrong. Sharon Angle versus Harry Reid. Angle was up by, I don't know how many, 5 or 6 in the latest polls, and then Reid ended up winning by 6. Colorado polls have frequently been off. Nate Silver just did a post on the history of Alaska polling, has just been terrible. So sort of another challenge for these fundamentals-based models is, can they guess in advance where the polls might be wrong? And so far, it's not really been shown that they can do that. When it comes to the night before the election, they're all going to be pretty much in agreement with what the polls are showing. So it's still an interesting challenge to predict in advance when the polls might be wrong, and no one really seems to have a clear idea of how to do that yet.
That's right. I think the Sharon Angle Harry Reid race did come into the Wong Silver spat, I believe, when Silver said that his model showed Reid winning despite Angle's kind of lead in the polls, and that Wong's model showed like a 99% confidence that Angle was going to win that race. And kind of he was saying that's why you need to not have a polls only model. That's why you need these fundamentals that he's analyzing and obviously
and also the different
it.
Treatment of uncertainty, though, because Nate's real objection there is that Sam's model had a really high projected chance, like 99.9 whatever percent of Angle winning, and his own model had an 80% chance or something like that. So if you make your forecast that much less certain, then, it is possible that, if you take a random drawing of, 5 different things, that you'll pick up the one. You have a 20% chance of getting a particular one for that drawing. So,
right.
An 80% forecast is not saying that such an outcome will always happen. It's saying that it'll happen 80% of the time.
Yeah. And even, I think this is an important point that I'm not sure if the media misunderstands it or the analysts who are reporting on the media misunderstand it, but these are, probabilistic models. It doesn't mean that if, let's say Wong's forecast has a 70% Democratic chance of holding the Senate and Silver's has 40%, and the Democrats hold. Silver's model could still have been right. It's just that it's one of the coin flips that turns out D instead of R, or the weighted die that turns out D instead of R. So people are, I think that really often, at least I see in the media, is that people take them as kind of not as they take it as long as you're above 50%, it's almost a certain chance, which is just not true. Both Silver and Wong will tinker with their models if their confidence was off, and they'll try and analyze and fix that for the future. But it still could be the case that one of their models is right, even when they're showing less than 50% chance for one of the sides.
Yeah, and it's also just kind of hard to conclusively say which is right. There's another dispute that's come up. Sam says that his model called every Senate race correctly in 2012, and I believe Nate's model missed, or Nate gave the Republican candidates a greater chance of winning in both Montana and North Dakota in 2012, and the Democrats ended up winning both seats.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is that, especially in North Dakota and in certain other races, like, they're really, really close.
Yeah.
And the question is whether it's even possible for a small amount of polls of these, especially these rural states that are not frequently polled, are really, whether the averages or estimates from those polls can be treated with such great confidence as to what's going to happen. And another issue that's come up, I've interviewed all of these guys, and some of them especially are particularly worried that the quality of polling this year has gotten worse. There are fewer polls. There are more partisan polls, less of the traditional gold standard of random digit dial live interviewer polls, and almost no polls in a couple key races like Alaska. And so sort of looming over this is the question of whether, like, how long, if polling keeps deteriorating like this, how long will these poll averages keep being on target? Like, there could be a year that comes when they're completely off, and it could even be this year, but they don't think that's going to be the case, but who knows?
Yeah, I know I've seen, at least in 2012, I haven't quite seen it this year, some of the polling outfits themselves were complaining about the aggregators, because before the aggregators, partisans would just latch on to individual polls from different outfits and kind of hold them up and say, oh, look, Rasmussen is the only poll that has Harry Reid winning. Let's believe Rasmussen. And now it's a lot harder to do that now that we have all of these kind of averages and these aggregators. And I wonder if the quality of polling, I mean, the obviously the demand for polling on an individual poll basis kind of declines as people move from individual polls as the outfits to follow into which aggregator do you like the most,
Yeah, and I've talked to some folks in the polling industry as well, and they say that since the rise of the aggregators, I guess before the rise of the aggregators, they used to be able to get a lot of media attention by releasing a new high-quality poll in a certain race. But now that there are so many modelers and forecasters and aggregators out there, any one particular new poll just goes right into the averages, and it doesn't get the same kind of media buzz and attention in the past that might have made it worthwhile and worth doing. So as a result, people are, the various pollsters are, especially because it's so expensive, it seems like less of a good deal to invest their money in doing these polls.
Right, yeah. And I mean, we can see the day when, the headline isn't PPP has Mary Landrieu up after having shown her down for a while. The headline would be, Nate Silver's polling average has Landrieu breaking 50% now. Those are the headlines that people are clicking on now rather than kind of individual polls. And I feel like the aggregators have succeeded in teaching the general public that an individual poll that might be an outlier is not very meaningful. Whereas in the past, it used to be. It used to be something that made news, made headlines, and sent traffic to websites and so on.
Yeah. And even when it comes to the very partisan audiences on both sides who used to be, back in 2004, there were a bunch of polling analysts who, on the Democratic side of the blogosphere, who came up with all these reasons as for why the polls were wrong and why Kerry was really going to win, and they were proven wrong. In 2012, we had sort of a bunch of conservative pundits doing a similar thing, and we had Dean Chambers of Unskewed Polls, like, trying to argue that the polls were wrong, and he was obviously proven wrong. So I think this year we're seeing the even political partisans on both sides have basically come to trust the averages and the modelers. I mean, not completely trust. You can come up with sophisticated critiques for how they might be wrong in certain areas or how their estimates could be off, but no one's like inventing their own, totally new way to do things anymore, like
Right.
Dean Chambers was in 2012. And so people are watching these very closely now, and it's a real victory for the people who've been working hard to average and aggregate these polls, that they've earned so much trust on both partisan sides at this point.
Well, a question about Dean Chambers, actually. So he ran unskewed polls, and you said he kind of made things up. It wasn't my impression that he made things up. It's that his justifications for his version of weighting the polls was just completely unfounded, right?
Oh, yes, that's what I mean. No, he didn't. He came up with a sort of various reasons why everybody else was doing it wrong and why he thought that his way was the best way to do it. He didn't just,
Right.
pull the numbers out of nowhere. But
well, it wasn't even just he was saying. It wasn't like he was saying, Rasmussen and Gallup are the ones to trust, and we're throwing out these other polls. I thought what he was doing was saying, these polls.
Yeah, he was trying to correct, I think, for what he saw as.
He was saying that the voter samples in these polls were wrong. They were sampling, D+8 and D+12
yes.
samples, and he was like, well, if it's a 50-50 electorate, then the polls would look like this. And he might be right that that's what the polls would look like with a 50-50 electorate, but that's just not a world that we're living in. So it was completely unfounded to actually correct in that manner.
Yeah, it's a common kind of blogosphere critique to look at an individual poll and just the first thing you look at is how many Republicans are in the sample and how many Democrats. But that doesn't tend to be a particularly useful critique, a lot of these guys have found. And most of these modelers don't even correct for that anymore, because in certain samples you'll get certain amounts of self-professed Democrats, maybe some conservative Democrats, maybe some liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, some independents who actually always vote for Democrats, or some independents who actually vote for Republicans. And polls that correct based on demographic factors in general, which are, race, sex, age, and stuff like that, are considered more. That sort of correction is considered more reliable than correcting for party ID, which is just a matter of identification rather than an immutable demographic characteristic.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be a replicable problem across polls that anything could fix. I wanted to talk to you about, because you guys, was it last week or the week before? Recently, Vox launched your own kind of election forecasting site, and this seems to be getting meta, but it seems like Vox is now aggregating the aggregators, and you guys have your own forecast average. And I wanted to ask you kind of how that process works. And, now that we are going to which aggregator are you following model, how do you get to a point where you say, all right, these are the aggregators that we're going to be following, and this is how we're going to come up with our own forecast model?
Well, I mean, it came out of, I've written a few articles on the differences between the forecasters at this point, I think going back to May. And at a certain point, we just figured, why not just create a central hub where people can go and see what the various forecasters that are out there are saying in each race, and look at the comparative estimates and link back to their sites so they can go check them out for themselves and figure out for themselves what they want to do. So we do have an average number, but it's more just for fun, really, to just a quick look at just a crude average of what all the modelers are saying right now. The 6 we included are the ones who created actual models that are predicting individual races and are coming up with percentage estimate chances for Democratic and Republican takeovers.
Well, let me stop you right there. You have, I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at your page right now, you have 8, not 6.
Oh, yes. Well, the percentage estimates, we have 6. But
okay, my
for
bad.
the seat share, we are actually including also Real Clear Politics and the generic ballot forecast from Alan Abramowitz, which I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, okay.
Those two don't come up with, 66% chance Democrats will take the Senate or something like that, but they do predict, how the seats will move or end up. So I do have those there in the very first toggle tab of the forecast hub.
Yeah, and to your point that the aggregators, the forecasters are coming together. You guys you're showing today. This might change tomorrow by the time this dialogue posts, but today there's a 2-seat difference on the extremes of the polls between the GOP getting 50 seats and the GOP getting 52 seats. So we might see this convergence, let's call it an October convergence in the polls coming. But they're really, for all of this fighting in the blogosphere that might be happening, there's really not all that much variance here.
Yeah, exactly. And there can be disagreements on methodology, but at the end of the day, all of these models are based on the polls, and the polls are showing a really close race right now in a couple of seats, and they're showing small advantages for a certain party or another in various other seats, and so most of the models move accordingly. I mentioned before that the Colorado race, it looked like Mark Udall, the Democrat, had been favored for most of the summer, and suddenly Cory Gardner is getting a bunch of good polls. And so the models deal with something like that, a change like that, in a different way. But if more polls keep coming out and showing Gardner ahead, then eventually they're all going to agree that he's favored to win.
Right. Now, what I find interesting in the forecast average, and this is more on the political side of things, are the like all of these averages, right, are treating the independents like Democrats. So Angus King and possibly if Pat Roberts loses, another independent caucusing with Democrats. But King has said, for example, that if Republicans win, he'll caucus with Republicans, which would slightly change the math here, but not when you're talking about how many seats it takes to control the Senate.
Yes. Yeah, when it comes to the actual seat share, there certainly might be movement later on. If Republicans end up picking up 52 seats, and Orman and King win, then maybe it'll actually end up being 54.
Right,
and forecasters basically say, well, that's not up to us. When it comes to the more interesting case of what if the Senate has 49 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and Greg Orman, the forecasters are actually dealing with that in different ways.
Really? I thought that Orman basically said, like King, he'll caucus with the with the party that controls the Senate.
Oh, yes, he did. But when it comes to, because he would make the difference if Democrats get 49 and Republicans get 50. Because he could be the 50th Democrat. And so he has said that in that case, he'll go to both parties and try to see which one would address his agenda more or something like that, or he would see what's best for Kansas or something like that. But he's definitely said that in that case he has not expressed a clear preference. So, but I think the thinking is that Republicans, Kansas Republicans and national Republicans are going to spend pretty hard to try to defeat him and to launch various attacks on him, and the Democrats will probably try to help him. So,
you could say the Democrats have already helped him in pushing their own candidate out of the race.
Oh, well, yeah, they certainly have. You had Claire McCaskill calling the Democratic candidate in Kansas and telling him to drop out of the race.
Yeah.
So, the modelers all have their different solutions for what to do in the case that Orman does make the difference, but I think when you talk to people, they generally expect that he would side with Democrats in that case, but you never know.
All right. Well, that's probably all about the time we have for today. Thanks a lot for joining me, Andrew.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And everyone, I would encourage them to go read Andrew's stuff on Vox. It's been really great on kind of how to read both the polls and the aggregators. And the Vox election kind of consensus forecast is really interesting. So thanks a lot again, and I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.
All right. Thanks, everybody.